Right now, let's head to the Artesia Historical Museum and Art Center. Mr. Michael Redman joins us. Michael, thank you so much for your time today.
Good morning.
So, didn't get a chance because, like I said, I had the ringer off. I didn't realize the phone was ringing until just before we went to air, so I didn't get a chance to ask you what we were going to talk about. So I guess I'll ask you on air. What are we going to be talking about today?
We're going to be talking about this day in history and how it sort of relates to New Mexico.
Okay.
New Mexico history.
All right.
Because this day in history, tomorrow actually, September 16th, 1893, was the land run of 1893 in Oklahoma. You have to look back to your high school history to try to remember that one.
Trying to think back, 1893, so this would have been post-Civil War.
Post-Civil War. It was the time that is right when Eddie and Hagerman were trying to find people to move to the brand new town of Eddy, which eventually became Carlsbad. So this was in Oklahoma, as implied by the name. And what happened, it was sort of a Victorian-era Black Friday land sale where thousands of people showed up in Oklahoma in order to lay claim to homestead lands that were suddenly made available. And so on September 16th, right at noon, people blew trumpets and fired gunshots in the air, and then suddenly thousands of people in wagons and on horseback went running out into the plains and tried to stake out their own homesteads.
Now, where did this land come from? Who had the land that was being made available for these grants?
It was Cherokee land.
Mm-hmm. But I mean,
Cherokee,
did the government have it? Did the Cherokee Nation do this? Did the railroads have this, and they were freeing it up?
It was a complex situation with the Cherokee Nation. They of course had the land that they gained by treaty in the 1830s. In the 1880s, the government acted as sort of an intermediary for this particular part of the Cherokee Nation. So it was not a simple setup. Mm-hmm. So they had the land, but the land was managed by the government, but the Cherokee Nation had a say in how it was managed. So it's technically their land, but it's also government land. And the government basically told them that they were no longer allowed to use the land themselves or to lease the land themselves to outside ranchers. They had to sell the land.
Okay.
And so the government took the land, partitioned it out as homesteads, and said that they would pay back the Cherokee Nation of the cost of the land, which they did. It took them about 50 years to do so, but they finally did.
Interesting. So the people that rushed in for this land, where did they primarily come from, and how would they have learned about it? Because we didn't have social media in 1893. We didn't even have cable television at that time. So how did that process come about?
Oh, it was in the newspapers. It was a major deal because there was a panic of 1893 was going on. There were a lot of people who lost their land, lost their homes, and there were a large number of squatters just hanging out in Oklahoma waiting for this to happen because they knew it was coming eventually that year.
Okay.
And so they, from all over the United States, these families showed up. And how it ties into New Mexico is that similar situations happened, just not to such a massive extent. So this was a part of relations between the Cherokee Nation and the United States. Over here in New Mexico, there were similar situations, but they followed different laws and different rules. So the Cherokee Nation, they had multiple treaties with the United States. So they amended treaties, and then Congress decided to get rid of the treaties. Over here, they were subject to the Dawes Act. Now, the Dawes Act in 1887 said that all Native American reservations need to be divided up into allotments. Lands would be given to all the residents on the reservations, and whatever was left over would be sold by the United States government.
Okay.
At the discretion of the president. And because of the reason why that came about, why they had the Dawes Act while the Cherokee Nation had treaties, was because of the way that relations between Native Americans and the United States had changed over the years. So, for example, when the first treaties were made between the United States and the Cherokee Nation, that was while the Cherokee Nation was still on the other side of the Mississippi. And over there, all the Native Americans were farmers, and it was a matter of, and the United States had not fully expanded, so it was a matter of the United States negotiating and fighting wars with foreign nations on the borders of the United States and slowly trying to take over the land. And for the Cherokee people, they were given the opportunity to move to Oklahoma in the 1830s.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't like that idea, so the Army forced them to move to Oklahoma as part of the Trail of Tears. But over here, the United States looked at the people here differently because, for the most part, they were not full-time farmers like the Cherokee people or the Iroquois people or anybody living on the other side of the Mississippi. And because of that, they did not consider them to be foreign nations on the United States border. They treated the Apache people and the Navajo people as more or less as stateless foreigners living on U.S. territory.
Okay.
So instead, they had laws and they had executive orders, and they were basically, they didn't negotiate over what lands was theirs and what land was not theirs. They're basically told what land was theirs. The United States at least looked at it from the perspective of trying to give them lands close to their traditional homelands in order to avoid future strife, but they still told them where they could live and did not accept input on matters. So, for example, the Mescalero people, they lived here before the mid-1800s. This, where Eddy County is, that was Mescalero land.
Right.
So the United States in the 1850s decided that the Mescalero people needed to be confined to reservations, and so the Army went over to where is now Fort Stanton, set up a fort there, started chasing after the Mescalero people and told them they had to stay there. They could not leave. And that's how the reservation came about. That came about because of an order from the U.S. Army, supported by executive orders issued to the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Okay.
So the Jicarilla people, Jicarilla Apache people, they had the same situation. They had pretty much all of northern New Mexico, from the modern-day Navajo Nation up to the Oklahoma border, going a little bit over into Oklahoma and a little bit into Colorado as well, and part of the Texas Panhandle.
Mm-hmm.
But they did some farming, but they were still mostly just people who lived out on the plains and found their food and went hunting. So the United States came in and told them that they could have a certain amount of land, but it took them many, many years to figure out where their land would be, because in the 1840s, 1848, when this area was annexed, what was the Jicarilla lands was technically the Maxwell land grants issued by Mexico, and the United States basically told Maxwell that he was the new agent for the Jicarilla people, and agents at that point were still sort of diplomats, not bureaucrats.
Mm-hmm.
And so the United States tried to figure out where they wanted the Jicarilla people to live, instead of asking them where they wanted to live. So at first they tried to tell them to move north of Santa Fe. They told them to just continue to live near Rayado, live near Taos, In 1864, they wanted them to move to Fort Sumner. The Hickory people said no. They ran off. They tried to send them to the San Juan area, up by Farmington. They said no. They tried to force them to move to the Mescalero Reservation in 1876. They said no.
Mm-hmm.
In 1880, they established a reservation around Amargo. They tried to settle there. They didn't really like it. They tried to force them to move to the Mescalero Reservation in 1883, and they actually did force them to move there. Then they forced them to move back to the new modern-day Hickory Reservation. So how does the Dawes Act fit into all this?
Right.
Well, the Dawes Act said that, like I said, land had to be allotted out to individuals. Adults head of families would get 160 acres. Children would get, if I remember correctly, children got 40 acres. Non-head of family adults got 80 acres. And so the land, the rest of it would be sold off. For the Mescalero people, that did not happen because the president simply said that he would not approve of any allotment because it was all mountainous. And he did not think that mountains would be good for farming.
Right.
So they did not allot it out. For the Hickory people, they actually did start the allotment process, but after 10 years they stopped and tried over again because a cultural practice of the Hickory Apache people is that they did not keep the same name for their entire lives. And they did not ask, and the people in charge of allotments did not ask them what their current names were, what their previous names were. And because of that, they started just giving them European names. And so after 10 years of trying to divide up the land, they decided that none of the property deeds were any good because they didn't know who had the land. So
Right.
they started over again.
Had to start over. So who admitted whether it was the Oklahoma land run or the similar deal in New Mexico? Who was the actual entity that administered this? Like, who did you go to, or who did you make your payment to, or who had the big chart that said this is still available or this is not available, or who would that have been?
That would have been the government surveying office, which I believe nowadays is part of the Bureau of Land Management.
Okay.
So this was all managed by the federal government, not by the individual tribal governments.
Sure. No, I figured there'd be a government entity. I was just kind of curious as to which one at that time would have been put in charge of that process.
And so it was surveyor's office. They had professional surveyors go through land, figure out how land could be divided up. And so when that happens with the Hickory people the second time around, as it turned out, there was not a lot of land, so they did not have to sell off a lot of the land that they had.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is when you look at the Hickory reservation outline, they actually gained land afterwards.
Okay.
They through buying lands, through the government using executive orders to transfer federal lands from the Bureau of Land Management over to them, they picked up a little bit of land, but they still lost some land. Something that the Mescalero people did not have to deal with. And the Navajo Nation, they lost, well, I'm sure you've seen maps of the Navajo Nation. You've seen the checkerboard designs all around it.
Mm-hmm.
That was all land that they lost from the Dawes Act.
For what they lost. And they still have a tremendous amount of territory, but it's not near as much as it was before the Dawes Act. Is that what you're saying?
Well, interestingly enough, they actually did manage to pick up more land since the Dawes Act was passed. They lost that initial land in that area, but they managed to buy lands elsewhere. They managed to convince the federal government to turn lands over to them, and they did grow,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting because for the most part, most of the reservations that were impacted by the Dawes Act wound up losing 2/3 or more of their land.
Wow. But the Apaches, Mescaleros didn't really lose that much, and the Navajo Nation eventually picked up more territory than what they had initially started with, is what I understand you're saying.
Yes, they still lost land, but they picked up land, unlike others. Of course, the oh, sorry.
No, I was saying yes. I was acknowledging what you're saying.
And what's really interesting is what happened with the Pueblos.
Okay.
Because they had a completely different arrangement with the government. Because of the way the United States approached Native Americans west of the Mississippi, they did not consider them to be. Well, it took them a while for them to eventually give them citizenship. They did not consider Native Americans to be capable of citizenship because they were not farmers.
Mm-hmm.
And so what utterly confused the United States government was after they annexed New Mexico and found the Pueblos, which were farmers. There were farmers at the Pueblos.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all they did. And so but they weren't European. They were Native American. So the government created a special sort of status for them where they did not have reservations. They were not subject to the Dawes Act, but they still were not citizens. They still did not have the right to vote, and their land was not considered Indian land, which was a legal consideration that had a lot of impact on what legally could be done in land, how land could be sold, what could be transported through the land, how railroads could be built through the land. So they had it took many years, some lawsuits, and then finally the Pueblo Lands Act of 1924 for them to be considered legally on par with the reservations. And because of that, the Pueblos did not have the protections from their land being squatted on or sold the way the reservations did before the Dawes Act and after the Dawes Act.
Michael, we've got about 30 seconds left before we run out of time. I'm sure we'll continue with this on next week's broadcast, but any quick notes about what's at the museum now for folks to come see?
Well, what's at the museum now is the Fashionable Founding Fathers exhibit, menswear of 1905. You can see it at the museum. Stop by the old Ward House, the one with the River Rock exterior. We are open 10 to 1, 2 to 4,